Well, if they did fall on deaf ears, but it's just the latest example in the really day by day, the deepening trade war that is underway between the United States and China. Yes, we are learning that U.S. officials privately behind the scenes urged China to not retaliate. In fact, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been saying that publicly all along, warning countries to not retaliate. Well, those warnings have fallen on deaf ears, particularly with China, as they raise their tariffs to 125%. The question now is which side is going to blink?
America, which has dominated the auto industry for years, is facing a shock that will change the future of the entire industry. Imagine the largest economic powerhouse losing over $219 billion in just a few days. This is not a fantasy, but a reality that the US is facing. Europe and Asia are deciding the fate of the US auto giants, and the implications are staggering.
We shouldn't be surprised with all that's coming out and all the worries about tariffs. It's not just that, it's the complexity of everything else as well. The changes within the federal government, the worries about job losses, the worries about a slowing economy, higher inflation, and eventually you get these what's known as soft data.
How is it that the world's largest automakers, Ford, GM, and Tesla, are on the brink of disaster? What is the cause of such a precipitous collapse, and who is actually capitalizing on this chaos? It all started with one decision that seemed insignificant, but soon led to an economic apocalypse for the US. Germany, the heart of the European auto industry, struck the first blow by freezing the certification of American electric cars. A simple import ban? No, it was a blow to the reputation, to the very essence of the US auto industry. Germany said it didn't trust US technology and environmental standards, and soon other European countries joined in. France introduced new tax laws that made American cars simply impossible to sell on the French market. But that wasn't all. Denmark decides to drop tax breaks for American electric cars, and Canada, one of the last allies of the United States, joined the European Union, announcing its full convergence with European standards.
Right now, 145 going up against 125. These are the tariffs between the world's two biggest economies.
And here's another number, 4,700, or about $400 per month. That is how much more money Yale's now estimating, the Yale Budget Lab, that President Trump's tariffs are going to cost average households each year. And with just hours left in trading, the Dow right now.
Markets are collapsing. Markets that American automakers have been targeting for so many years. Tesla is losing its leadership in Europe, and Ford and GM are seeing their giant factories go without orders. Who benefits from this situation? Who is really behind such a massive blow to the American economy? Are we expecting a new era of European and Chinese dominance of the global auto industry? At this time, amid the international shock, American auto giants are facing unprecedented pressure. Markets are collapsing, stocks are plummeting, jobs are disappearing. More than 200,000 people are losing their jobs, factories are shutting down, and roads once full of American cars are becoming empty. So who is to blame for this disaster? Perhaps it is the result, not only of economic policy, but also of the mistaken belief that the US will always be ahead.
In other words, pre-substitution, if we just continue as we are now. But of course, people will start to substitute. They will find other goods. And as the Christmas Tree Association said a moment or two ago, it's going to be very difficult to find substitution of many things that we currently get from China.
But what comes next? The US is preparing to retaliate, but can it really make a difference? And what does this mean for the future of the global economy and those who hold power in the world of the auto industry today? The answers to these questions await us in the next review. A story that shook the foundations of the global economy. In the heart of the global automobile market, where yesterday everything seemed stable, several of the most powerful players collapsed at once. The total losses of the American automobile industry amounted to more than $219 billion in just a few days. That's not just a loss, it's a full-blown disaster, the effects of which will no doubt be felt for years to come. So how did it happen that the US, a country with a long automotive tradition, was on the brink of destruction?
Up. You're seeing that swing here going into the afternoon, up almost 650 points. But it was up and down there throughout earlier in the day. With us now, we have CNN business editor-at-large Richard Quest. We have CNN chief national security analyst Jim Sciutto as well. Richard, a key economic gauge, the consumer sentiment now at its second lowest level on record. Going back to 1952. Why?
It all started with the German strike against American electric cars. Germany, which for many years was considered not only the economic but also the technological giant of Europe, at one point made not only a political but also an economic move that could not go without consequences. In the first half of January, Germany unexpectedly announced a certification freeze for all American electric cars produced for the European market. An expected move, would you say? Hardly. The reason why the German authorities made this decision was one thing. American companies, primarily Tesla, did not meet the new environmental standards that every car produced for the European market had to meet. Under the new requirements, which came into effect at the beginning of this year, all cars manufactured outside the EU had to demonstrate full transparency about the origin of battery materials, as well as have full reporting of CO2 and other pollutants emitted during their production. This was a real challenge for the US, as despite the best efforts of companies like Tesla, environmental standards in the US have proven to be largely less stringent than in Europe. At the same time, German authorities have not limited themselves to just rejecting certifications.
Yeah, you'll be surprised just how much we get exclusively from China. And Jim, I'm really curious to get your perspective on the White House's handling of this situation. Not so much the tariffs that have been announced, but this reporting that the White House, that officials have made clear to Beijing that they want Xi to ask for a call with Trump.
All companies, including the biggest players Tesla, Ford, and General Motors, have faced sudden and not insignificant fines for non-compliance. Some of the cars produced in the US were simply banned from being imported into the European market. For example, the latest Tesla Model Y models that were supposed to enter the ports of Bremerhaven were stopped and sent back. A special audit was organized for Ford to check every detail of the car, from software to the efficiency of recycling materials during production. The very same Ford Explorer, which was supposed to be one of the flagships of the American car industry in the EU market, was blocked in Germany before even reaching the point of sale.
The Chinese impression is that they are willing to at least negotiate, not necessarily on Donald Trump's terms, but to talk. But their impression is that the U.S. has not opened channels and not made an effort to open up channels.
Equally serious was the impact of France's actions, which, in response to the German decision, literally collapsed an entire sector of American cars, forcing them to become uneconomical for French consumers. When France decided to impose new tariffs on cars made in the US, the action became not just legal, but deeply political. Under the new rules, which went into effect in the second half of January, the importation of every car weighing more than 2,000 kilograms and with an engine capacity of more than 250 horsepower came with an additional 30% tax. Such a measure hit the most popular American models, including the Ford F-150, Chevrolet Tahoe, and, more importantly, even electric vehicles such as General Motors' Hummer EV. Whereas French automakers such as Renault, Citroën, and Peugeot had previously depended on American electric car technology in one way or another, they now have a strategic advantage. Not surprisingly, in response to such a blow, car dealers across France have begun abandoning imported cars en masse. Demand for large and powerful American cars plummeted, as many French buyers could not afford such expensive, highly taxed models. Dealers were forced to cancel contracts with American manufacturers, and, most unpleasantly for the US, this strategy was more than successful. In response, US automakers, including Tesla, claimed that such actions by France were nothing more than covert protectionism. They argued that French authorities had effectively declared American cars technologically obsolete, even though many of them met the highest environmental standards, especially in terms of CO2 emissions. The problem was not only the innovation of the tax laws, but also the social significance. France, like many other European countries, continued to actively promote the ideas of sustainable development, environmental security, and the fight against global climate change. And although their actions were perceived as a harsh measure, Paris believed that it would help them to stimulate the domestic market and overcome dependence on foreign producers.
to allow that. So now you have the U.S. president say, well, I'm not going to open those channels. China has to open them first. It's kind of ridiculous at the end of the day, because you are playing with the interests of American consumers, Chinese consumers, etc. The other point I would make about China's reaction today in not quite meeting the U.S. tariffs, 145% U.S., China goes to 125. And in Xi's statement, he says, we're going to 125 in response. That's as high as we're going because this is getting a little ridiculous, right? And that's both a signal to say we're not going to get caught up in this tit for tat to the degree that the president is.
Simultaneously with the development of the crisis in Europe, attention turned to the third country, which could not stay away from the current events, Denmark. The key point here was the government's refusal to provide tax credits for the purchase of American-made electric cars. The changes made to the tax rules for electric cars caused Tesla, Ford, and General Motors cars to lose competitiveness in the Danish market. The problem was not the quality of these cars, but the fact that the new tax credit system primarily supported those who priced cars inside Europe. The Danish government announced a new subsidy mechanism that included exclusively European brands and models. Soon Tesla and Ford, which used to be very popular in Denmark, became extremely unfavorable to buy, and many cars saw prices increase by several $1,000s. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that competitors from France, Germany, and other EU countries were now in much more favorable conditions. The strategy may have seemed politically neutral at first glance, but it was fundamentally changing the market situation by pushing Danish consumers to choose cars produced inside Europe. These actions were not only an economic but also a political attack. While Germany, France, and Denmark conducted their economic maneuvers, the US stayed on the sidelines, not taking action to protect its interests. As we can see, the beginning of the new year was marked not only by losses in the US auto market, but also by turning points in international trade. Europe, aiming to create an independent and technologically advanced automotive ecosystem, actually excluded American companies from its zone of influence. In this context, the US lost not only financial resources but also influence in the area of technological standards that used to be its property.
There are surveys like the Michigan survey, consumer sentiment, and it's a really worrying number because at some point these sentiment surveys feed into hard data of real consumer spending. And we know this from history and precedent, that's what happens. So when we see a number as bad as this one, it is only a matter of time, unless anything else changes that would suddenly make people more cheerful. Look at that chart. I mean, just look at it. Unless people suddenly become more cheerful, why would this not translate into spending? You see, that consumer lab, the lab from Yale, that number of 4,700, that is providing you don't start substituting goods.
When Denmark, a small but important part of the European market, suddenly came into conflict with the largest American automakers, many thought that the move would be more symbolic than decisive. But events unfolded rapidly and unpredictably. In the first weeks of February, the Danish government announced the exclusion of all American electric cars from the tax credit program, which immediately hit Tesla and Ford's market. It was a move that seemed political on the one hand and an extremely effective economic weapon on the other. Up until that point, Tesla had enjoyed unprecedented demand in Denmark thanks to subsidies that brought the price of electric cars down to a level affordable to most citizens. However, with the introduction of new laws passed by the Ministry of Taxation, all American electric cars became unaffordable for most Danes. The new tax mechanism excluded all cars made in the US, and European models were heavily promoted instead. This move was not only a blow to the financial interests of American manufacturers, but also a symbol of the growing discontent in Europe over US dominance.
Lived in China, you've covered China for some time now. As we're looking at this question of who's going to blink first, with two very different political systems, what is your gauge on this?
Well, different systems, listen, one's a democracy, one is not. One's a single-party state, very much not a democracy. But China does have politics, and Chinese leaders do not want to be seen, we were talking about this yesterday, I believe, do not want to be seen as capitulating to America. That is not good politics for a Chinese leader.
The situation was aggravated by the fact that at the same time a strict environmental policy aimed at reducing carbon emissions and reducing dependence on foreign energy sources was in effect. And while the US has always prided itself on its achievements in clean technology, Europe has increasingly relied on its own designs and standards. Denmark, which has traditionally been an advocate of strict environmental regulations, has been adamant that it can no longer afford to support foreign companies whose production does not meet the European Union's most stringent standards. This was no accident. The Danish government had set a goal of supporting only those manufacturers based in the EU, which effectively meant declaring a boycott for all cars made outside of Europe. At the same moment, Canada, represented by Prime Minister Mark Carney, made a decision that literally shook the political and economic picture. In early March, Carney, standing next to President Macron in Paris, signed a strategic partnership agreement with the European Union that effectively united Canada with Europe in the production and certification of electric cars. This union meant that all Canadian automakers were now required to meet standards that were already in place in the EU, which in turn made it much more difficult for US manufacturers who were still trying to maintain their position in the Canadian market. Canada, which had traditionally been one of the largest trading partners of the US, at that moment seemed to have surrendered its allies. The Carney government announced that it could not continue to maintain trade with the US as it had before, and that the Canadian market must integrate into the European system of certification and production of electric vehicles. This was a severe blow to US automakers whose production depended on Canadian plants and supplies. The advent of such a union between Canada and the EU created incredible political tension and jeopardized not only US economic interests, but also Canadian and American job security.
But it's also an opening to say, okay, we're capping this for now, and that perhaps offers a way forward that we could begin talking about how to bring these down.
During this time, new initiatives in Europe continued unabated. Most notably, Germany, which had so decisively closed its doors to American electric cars, decided to promote its own standards, not only for the domestic market, but for all of Europe. In particular, the German authorities began to develop new financial instruments, such as the EVI 100 index, which was to further track only those companies that produce electric cars in Europe that meet all the new environmental standards. This index immediately attracted the attention of investors, and the very fact of its appearance signaled Europe's full transition to a model of independence from the US in the production and certification of cars. EVI 100 quickly gained popularity among investors, and in the first weeks after its launch, more than $50 billion from funds supporting green technologies were invested in it. This was a real revelation for US automakers who were already facing challenges in the US market. The composition of the index companies included leading European automakers such as Volkswagen, Beam and Renault, as well as startups involved in new technologies such as battery recycling and developments in hydrogen engines. All of these companies have begun to benefit exclusively from European tax incentives, receiving additional subsidies from the European Investment Bank and European private investors. In turn, American companies such as Tesla and General Motors found themselves outside this new circle of privileged manufacturers. The situation amidst all these changes took a sharp turn for the worse when the European Commission unexpectedly announced that it would close the possibility for all American cars to work with local software for autonomous driving. The decision hit Tesla, which had built its reputation on cutting-edge autopilot technology, hard. On top of that, EU countries began to deny certification of US autonomous driving software solutions, stating that US developments did not meet strict European standards for safety and transparency. One of the most prominent examples was the situation with Tesla's autopilot system, which was scrutinized and deemed unsafe for European roads. European Union government authorities stated that such a system could not be certified until all identified risks were addressed. The next, equally important point that put additional pressure on the financial markets was the claims of losing market share. Tesla, which has long been the leader in electric cars, now faces a huge challenge. All its ambitions to expand into European and Canadian markets have been overturned by new legislation and changes in the political situation. Against this background, the decline was not only in sales but also in the ambitions of Elon Musk himself, who, despite his determination, could no longer regain lost ground. This was especially felt in the countries of Europe, where Tesla had been considered a technological leader for so long. The loss of upscale customers who used Tesla as an indicator of social status caused sales of the Model S, Model X and other high-end models to drop 36% in just a few weeks. The creation of new financial instruments, such as the EVI 100 index, which literally squeezed American companies out of the market, played no small role in breaking the American monopoly in the market. EVI 100, which was a new instrument for investors, became an important signal for all participants of the global automobile industry. It completely excluded American cars, which became a kind of marker of the global transition from American dominance in electric cars to new European standards. This index not only tracked the shares of leading European manufacturers, but also created serious obstacles for American companies that did not meet the strict standards. Consequently, many investors began shifting their funds to companies that could work with European standards, which put even more pressure on US automakers. An equally important factor was Tesla's withdrawal from Europe, which was a real blow to the entire US auto industry. At the end of April, the company officially announced the closure of all its plants in Germany, France and Denmark, citing unacceptable business conditions and strict environmental requirements. As a result, Tesla's European share was completely reallocated to local manufacturers such as Volkswagen and BMW. Moreover, the company announced a complete reallocation of its resources towards Southeast Asia, where the electric car market was not only growing but also much more flexible in terms of regulations. The move was not only a financial loss, but also a moral defeat for many who had long believed in the American auto industry as an unquestioned leader. The US electric vehicle industry was isolated, and attempts to regain lost confidence were futile. European governments, which had imposed harsh sanctions on American cars, were in no hurry to back down, strengthening their position on the global stage. Against this backdrop, the US was left struggling to regain its position, but instead faced a new reality, a reality in which its cars became unsuitable for European and Canadian markets. America had no more allies, and every new step taken by its automakers only made the situation worse. This crisis was a milestone for the entire auto industry, and a harsh reminder that when the old rules of the game become irrelevant, even those who once seemed invincible can become losers. The stakes in the game continued to rise, and the future of the US auto industry remained very much in doubt.